This is Learn Liberties' countdown of 8 consequential costs of war you didn't realize. Number 8, war destroys infrastructure. Wars often damage ports, factories, power plants, roadways, farms. The negative impacts that result are harder to see than the raw death tolls of troops. The post-9/11 wars in the Middle East show the evidence. A 2010 survey of Iraqi households showed a high rate of injuries from the destruction of urban infrastructure, including from electric shock and falls. More recently, as of February 2023, the Russian Federation's aggression had led to the destruction of 25,000 kilometers of roads and 344 bridges and overpasses. The railway system saw 507 kilometers of track and 126 stations damaged. 19 civilian airports were damaged, with the runway destroyed at 12 of them. All this destruction will lead to suffering for years, long after the war is technically over. Worst of all, in Yemen, Hodeidah port had been receiving 70 to 80% of that country's commercial imports. But when it was damaged in a 2015 aerial bombing, we saw a rise in water insecurity because it became impossible to transport. The World Health Organization said that more than 80% of the country's population struggles to access sufficient foods, safe drinking water, and adequate health services. It estimated that approximately 15 million Yemenis lacked access to potable water and sanitation. This was a major contributor to Yemen's mass cholera epidemic in 2016, which infected around half of the population of 25 million people and killed an estimated 2,000 people. Meanwhile, also thanks to the destruction of infrastructure, Libya is one of the most water-scarce countries in the world. In 2022, 58% of households there had to rely on bottled water, and only 22% had access to safe sanitation. If the famous quote, "You can no more win a war than an earthquake," resonates with you, check out Students for Liberty's local coordinator program. Someday, maybe we can make war a thing of the past. Number 7, war helps politicians get creative with the budget. And boy, do we not want politicians getting creative. Governments have traditionally financed war through taxation. In fact, Adam Smith proposed more than 3 centuries ago that wars should only be financed with taxes. That way the public could directly see the expense of those wars. In Smith's day, it was the British government's constant extension of its colonial empire, which he thought was a waste of money. But in recent times, political leaders have found another method to pay for their wars: debt financing. Essentially, they've removed the requirement to have a balanced budget, and that has led to this nasty, self-reinforcing spiral of spending more and more on the war machine, as politicians have parlayed this tactic of borrowing not just to overspend on war, but to overspend on defense too. Borrowing, or debt financing as Adam Smith reasoned, shields the public from the direct costs of war, which reduces opposition and grants leaders more flexibility in executing military operations. In the US, for example, the Fed can buy the debt created by wars, which means the rest of the market doesn't have to absorb that debt. If the market did have to absorb it, interest rates would rise, and that would also make the cost of war more obvious. One researcher analyzed recent wars and found that the same war, when financed with taxation, would have about 16% less support. And if you go from, say, 50% support to 34% support for an invasion, well, that could be the difference between the invasion happening or not. Number 6, war helps politicians undercut civil liberties. Now, I know, the same could be said for any emergency, but since time immemorial, war has been the leading excuse for governments to cut down on citizens' liberties. One shocking example came from the man many people rank as the greatest American president. In 1863, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended some of the most fundamental rights citizens possess. The writ of habeas corpus, from the Latin for "that you have the body," protects citizens from indefinite detention and provides the right to a hearing and a trial in front of a jury of your peers. Lincoln literally suspended that right, at least in cases involving prisoners of war, spies, traitors, or any member of the military. Later, there were the Japanese internment camps during World War II, the Red Scare and McCarthyism during the Cold War, and more recently, since the 9/11 attacks, the US has seen an explosion of mass surveillance. Note the Patriot Act, where long-standing rules preventing the state from monitoring US citizens without probable cause were demolished, with minimal debate or opposition in Congress. This infringement on civil liberties by the FBI and CIA hit historically marginalized groups the hardest. Mass surveillance has intensified the criminalization of racialized suspect communities, from Muslims and Arabs to Latino communities to Black and indigenous organizers. Edward Snowden said it well. The panic after 9/11 made us politically vulnerable. That vulnerability was exploited by our own government to entitle itself to radically expanded powers. And speaking of Snowden, check out our exclusive interview with him about how democracy is under surveillance and how surveillance is all about power. Link in the description. Number 5, war takes a psychological and cultural toll. The stories of Vietnam vets returning home as shattered shells of their former selves are as legendary as they are haunting. But Vietnam vets were far from the only ones to experience what we now call PTSD. That's been a phenomenon of war forever. The term shell shock originated during World War I, and by the way, see our recent video for 12 other legacies of World War I. A 2021 paper estimated that more than 30,000 active duty personnel and veterans of the post-9/11 wars had died by suicide, which is more than 4 times more than the service members who died in those wars themselves. War takes a toll on the public, too. Constant states of fear, a bombardment of propaganda, the dehumanization of the enemy, those all affect the well-being of populations. Globally, it's estimated that anxiety and depression are 2 to 4 times greater than average among war-affected populations. And this is becoming a theme, right? These effects hit historically marginalized groups especially hard. Women suffer from gender-based violence, which rises in wartime. In Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, rape and sexual violence increased. Children are also particularly vulnerable to trauma and violence. Research shows that children who experience high levels of collective violence are twice as likely to develop chronic diseases. A 2014 survey showed that 4 out of 10 school children under age 16 in Mosul, Iraq, had mental health disorders, such as PTSD. Children are also deeply affected by the mental health issues of their caregivers, such as depression. Finally, child malnutrition statistics indicate the scale of war's damage to population health. This report calculated that more than 7.6 million children under 5 are suffering from acute malnutrition in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. Number 4, wars have disastrous long-term economic consequences. The broken window fallacy is just that, a fallacy. Throwing a brick through a window doesn't create jobs because the window needs to be repaired. It eliminates something valuable the window repairman could have been doing otherwise. So too for war. It doesn't create jobs or help the economy because the manufacturing of the bullets and tanks is work that could and should have been employed for other purposes. However, war can lead to economic stagnation when societies are built around this constant war preparation. The resources that should be going toward more productive ends get diverted toward war. War affects markets too. Since the end of the Cold War, markets for commodities like crude oil, natural gas, and even wheat have become more integrated thanks to freer trade, technological improvements, and better transportation. Those markets have supported global growth and have helped raise living standards, especially in emerging markets. The war in Ukraine put that process in reverse. According to the IMF World Economic Outlook 2023, for the first time since the 70s, commodities were broadly used to exert pressure in a major conflict. They said the disruptions in commodity trade contributed to inflation in many parts of the world, food insecurity in low-income countries, and slower global growth. Estimates of long-term losses from the restriction of the flow of goods and services, finance, and technology range from 0.2% to 12% of global GDP. Number 3, wars lead to increased government power. We described how war helps politicians undermine civil liberties, but it does more than that. It leads to increased government power overall. because emergency measures implemented during times of war often become institutionalized. This is known as the ratchet effect, according to economic historian Robert Higgs. His 1987 study found that much of the U.S. government's growth in the 20th century was caused by this ratchet effect. Here's how he described it. In times of crisis, war being chief among them, people demand increased government services and interventions, as they come to believe a larger government is needed to combat the crisis. The scope of government is expanded during the crisis, but then afterward, the government's scope does not revert all the way back to where it was. Envision a ratchet. As you tighten it, the range of motion decreases and it becomes more difficult to loosen. Higgs theorizes that interests which benefit from the growth of government lobby to keep the new policies, and individuals don't demand government revert to its original scope because they grow accustomed to this new role of the state. Two other researchers found that war could permanently expand the size of government for non-Higgsian reasons too. They argued that when a country unexpectedly has a war imposed on it, that country might find it necessary to increase its offering of benefits to veterans in order to induce enlistments. Then after the war, the need to fulfill those promises leads to increased government spending and taxation. Number 2, war is bad for the earth and the sea. What if I told you the death toll of World War I's bloodiest battle is still growing? The Battle of Verdun resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German and French soldiers from February to December 1916, but unexploded explosive artifacts from that conflict still pose a threat. As if that weren't bad enough, a World War I grenade was recently found in a shipment of French potatoes. Another troubling truth. After World War II, the sea off the coast of Germany was turned into a dumping ground for grenades, bombs, torpedoes, and chemical weapons such as mustard gas. Research has revealed contamination of marine fauna and flora and has identified a further, even scarier risk, the risk of explosion, which could occur during ship passages or during the construction of wind farms or submarine pipelines. Number 1, war is bad for the air. Do you know what happens when a nuclear bomb detonates? The blast kills or poisons everything within a 2-mile radius. That much we know from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even regular old non-atomic bombs used in subsequent wars, particularly the 1991 Gulf War in Iraq, have contained toxic substances, including heavy metals, white phosphorus, depleted uranium, and dioxin. One study showed that levels of lead in children in Basra, Iraq, were 4 to 50 times higher than in neighboring countries that were not at war. And doctors in Iraq report an unusually high rate of miscarriages and premature births and birth defects, including anomalies such as cleft palates and spinal deformities. Iraqi public health officials have blamed the depleted uranium used by the US in the Gulf War. It's worth emphasizing. Even aside from the awful and tragic direct deaths they cause, explosive weapons themselves are detrimental to the environment. And the destruction of buildings generates debris and releases hazardous materials such as asbestos, industrial chemicals, and fuels. And because we're living in a nuclear age, those effects could get even worse in future wars. According to one climate analysis model, in a limited nuclear war involving 100 atomic bombs, the entire global climate would be affected. More than 5 million tons of soot from the industrial areas targeted by those bombs could be spewed into the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to fall by an average of 1.3 degrees Celsius, which, among other things, would disrupt the growing season in many areas. The International Committee of the Red Cross estimated that soybean and corn production in the Midwestern United States, as well as rice production in China, would be 20% lower in the years immediately following this kind of war, and 10% lower even after a decade. In addition, there would be a large reduction in ozone levels in the upper atmosphere, allowing increased levels of harmful ultraviolet light to reach the Earth's surface. But that's not all. Even the testing of nuclear weapons, which is likely to continue whether or not those weapons ever get used, has had major detrimental effects. For example, exposure to radioactive pollution and heightened concentrations of radioactive isotopes caused an increase in thyroidal cancer after the nuclear tests carried out in Nevada during World War II. So while it's easy to get wrapped up in the death tolls of soldiers, those are 8 high and tragic costs of war we don't often see. They're worth considering the next time the drums of war start up and the politicians ask for your support. Taking real-world action is also worth considering. If you're a motivated, passionate young person, check out Students for Liberty's local coordinator program.